All right, so in today's segment, well, let me get this one first. So what we're going to do in today's segment is we're going to watch clips from two films. The first film is Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, which is a film made in 1995. And it's directed by a person called Aditya Chopra, who's the son of Yash Chopra. So the Chopra family has been involved in filmmaking for several decades. You know, the sort of the patriarch of the clan, B.R. Chopra, the older brother of Yash Chopra, made a number of films that became highly influential in commercial mainstream cinema, going back several decades. And his younger brother Yash Chopra, who is now, he just passed away a short while ago. He was himself quite a legendary figure in what is called Bollywood. And this is a film made by his son, his debut as a director, a film made in 1995. The second film that we're going to see clips from, both of these films are discussed in the article that has been assigned to you by Patricia O'Broy. You know, you can get more details and the plot summaries for both of these films. So the second film is Pardes. The first one is Dilwale. We'll just call that Dilwale, DDLJ, as it's known by its acronym. Pardes is a film made in 1997. When you see the opening scene of this film, you'll see how it very closely echoes the first film, although there are substantial differences you know, between the two films. Now, before we start seeing the clips, I want to just say a few more things by way of introduction to Indian cinema. I had given you a different kind of introduction in my previous lecture, where I pointed out to you that if you look at the history of Indian cinema, you know, we go from a concern with the village, which is the setting of Hindi films in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, you know, even moving into the 60s. And then the city starts to become more predominant. By the 1950s, it's a noticeable part of the landscape of the Hindi film. And then moving into the 90s, when neoliberalization policies become important, and Indian diasporic presence becomes important. There was always a diaspora, of course, as you all know by now, a much older Indian diaspora, but that was never really something that registered on the minds of most people living in India for reasons that I've already spoken to you about, among them being the fact that the older diaspora was a diaspora under very different conditions. Many of the people who had gone had gone as indentured laborers. Not all of them, of course. Right? But all of this is something that we've discussed at some length. And then, as I said, in the mid-1990s, once the Indian population in places such as the United States begins to become somewhat influential, the diaspora is now going to be reflected in the Hindi cinema, right? So that's sort of the rough outline that I had suggested to you, to the point where, indeed, by the mid-1990s, I think it would be safe to say that the village had been more or less eviscerated from the mainstream Hindi film. It just wasn't there to be seen. You know, and even as late as, let's say, the mid-1970s, one of the most well-known Hindi films ever made, a film that I recommend very highly to you, called Sholay, right? Embers, you know, in a flame, right? This film, which was made in 1975, the same year that Diwar was made, starring Amitabh Bachchan, and again, a hugely successful film. This film was still based in the setting of the village. The village was the setting of this film, through the 1980s, you know, you begin to see this transition, and then by the mid-1990s, late 1990s, the village has almost entirely been eviscerated. And this contrast is going to be important, because in the film that you're going to see today, the clips that you're going to see today, Pardes and Dilwale, the village does appear, but it appears in a very particular kind of setting, because it has to do with the return of the diasporic figure, and the longing and nostalgia for India, which again is expressed largely through the trope of you know, the village, you know, the green fields, the mustard fields, you know, the feel of the soil, the smell of the soil, things of that kind, right? The background that I want to suggest to you needs to be complemented in one other respect, and that is to give you a different kind of sociological portrait of the Hindi femme. This is something that I think Oberoi and a number of other people talk about, I think, quite adequately in their work. So I'm going to be rather brief about that, but both of these films that you see are films which obviously have to do with such things as the relations between the sexes, the relations with the family, the relations between different social classes. So for example, in this film Pardes, one of the issues that comes up is that the diasporic figure who has lived abroad for 35 years and his son has in fact never even visited India, right? His son has never visited India. He goes back to India. The father meets up with an old friend of his and eventually comes to the conclusion when he meets up with his old friend that this old friend's daughter, whose name is Ganga, and this name is not accidental, it's just not any name. Obviously there's a significance here because Ganga is also the name of the river, and Ganga is the river that more than anything else in some ways seems to symbolize the idea of India, correct? So eventually what he's going to suggest to his old chum is that, well, I'd like to have my son married off to your daughter, and at first the man says that, well, his friend says that, well, but, we come from very different social background. Would it be acceptable to you because you're now, a billionaire living in the United States and here I am a humble, peasant. Well, he's not really a humble peasant because he has a relatively huge farmhouse, but he's still somebody who belongs to a different social class. Right? So questions about relations between social classes, relations within the family, the idea of family values, right? And family values being a crucial marker of Indianness. This is, properly speaking, the subject of these films, with, of course, that connection to the Indian diasporic population living in the United States, or as in the case of Dilwale, living in Britain. And as I think that Patricia Oberoi points out quite correctly, when you see these films, the things that you ought to be looking for are, well, what kind of anxieties are there about modernization, okay, and the loss of identity? And why is it that these anxieties are largely focused on women's sexuality? Because that is going to be actually one of the central questions in Pardes. Now, it may well be that the anxieties about modernization and identity loss are focused on women's sexuality in almost every culture, you could say. Right? But it seems to be emphatically the case here in these films. And obviously, there are some very elementary kind of questions that need to be asked. So what does it mean to be an Indian in the diasporic setting? Is it different than being an Indian back in India itself? Do notions of India get reified? Is culture and tradition, are culture and tradition the same thing, or are they different? Can one jettison certain kinds of traditions and still be true to the culture? Right? So you could certainly make a distinction between certain traditions and the idea of culture. And there's a whole stream of historiography which, over the course of the last 3-4 decades, in fact, I would say that there was a book that came out which became highly influential, and particularly those of you who are history students or more broadly interested in the idea of culture, I think you would want to look at this book. It's called The Invention of Tradition. And one of the arguments that is made in this book that is advanced through a number of essays. So it's actually a collection of essays, and these essays range over a broad range of material. Okay? But they essentially come to the same conclusion, that very often what we think of as timeless traditions are in fact invented traditions. So what would be an illustration of that? If you ask most Scots, right, they'll tell you, well, bagpipes have always been a part of Scottish culture. Well, they have not. Right? This is what's called an invented tradition. The turban for the Sikh. Let's take an example closer to home from the point of view of this class. Right? So if you ask most Sikhs, well, they'll tell you a turban has been inextricably a part of Sikh identity. Well, it hasn't been. In fact, the turban became important during the colonial period, when partly it was used in the army, in which a large number of Sikhs were recruited. So there's a disproportionate number of Sikhs that are recruited into the Indian army in the colonial period. The reason for that is that the Sikhs were considered to be a martial race. Right? So this is a theory that the British had, where they divided all Indians into two categories. I mean, there are different classificatory systems, but one of the predominant classificatory systems after the rebellion of 1857 is to divide all Indians into two groups of people, the martial races and the non-martial races. Right? So if you were a Sikh, you were considered to be a martial race, and therefore you were disproportionate numbers of these people were recruited into the Indian army. A legacy that continued on in independent India, that continues on to the present day, but in much diminished numbers. Okay? So now this turban, it becomes a marker of Sikh martial identity, if I may put it this way. Right? But if you talk to most Sikhs, they'll say, well, the turban has always been inextricably a part of Sikh culture. It's not. It's an invented tradition. Just as bagpipes are an invented tradition in Scottish culture. Right? So now the question will be, why should all of this matter? It matters because when we are looking at notions of Indian culture, okay, and particularly in this film Pardes, Dilwale as well, there'll be scenes where so for example in Pardes, the heroine, right, she's engaged to this chap. I've already mentioned that, right, that her father and the boy's father, they come to an agreement. So here there's a question about patriarchy here, because essentially it's a matter of agreement between the two fathers, and women are to be exchanged, essentially. Right? So you go from one family home to another family home. You leave your natal home and then you go to the family home of your in-laws. Okay? And the idea is that you actually gift the girl. So in fact there is a ceremony called Kanyadan. Kanyadan is the gift of the Kanya. Kanya is a girl, and Kanya typically also means not just girl, but it is understood that she's a virgin. Right? So it's a gift of the girl. So this is, in a sense, implied in these transactions here. So she's going to be given to this man, right, in marriage. Okay, and what's going to happen is that when she comes to the United States, highly unusual scenario where before marriage she comes to this man's home, because the bridegroom that has been selected, he says that, look, I mean, I don't really know this girl. I've lived in America all my life. She's lived in India. Perhaps she should come here and get somewhat accustomed to American culture. All of that. So she's going to come for a period of time, but it's understood that they're going to have a chaste relationship. And there's a scene of an attempted rape at one point in the film, nearly towards the end of the film, where he says that, look, I'm going to get married to you, so we might as well have sex right now. And she says, well, that's not done in our culture. It's not done, hamari sanskriti mein ye nahi hai. It is not in our culture to do so. Right? So there are certain notions of what constitutes culture. And one of the things that you might want to think about is that, what is the distinction between tradition and culture? Are they the same? Are they always congruent? Culture may be something that is much more amorphous. Right? And this is what I was talking to you about the other day, when in the closing moments I said, well, imagine if somebody said to you, what do you understand by American culture? And I think that we may come to some agreement about a number of things perhaps, but there will be a huge area of disagreement as well. Right? And obviously for civilizations that are much older and much more complex in some ways, the number of considerations that might come into play might be greater. So when you see these films, keep this in mind. Keep in mind what is the nature of the diasporic setting here. All right. Are there differences between the US and India drawn too sharply? The differences between the homeland and the diaspora, the differences between the East and the West. Right? You could say that there are a number of binaries that are obviously operational in these two films. In a much more aggravated form in the film Pardes than in Dilwale, certainly. The contrast between East and West, between India and America, between tradition and modernity, right? There are any number of oppositions that which obviously come into place. And finally then, as I said, what are the kinds of anxieties that become very marked in the diasporic setting? These anxieties might exist everywhere. I mean, there are people in in India who belong to the middle class who certainly have anxieties about their daughters growing up. And you could say that, well, everybody does in every culture, right? And particularly daughters. And that may have to do, obviously, with the fact that a great deal of investment is made in the idea of women's sexuality not being appropriated by somebody else who's alien, right? So these are, I think, questions that are prominent in both of these films. And without giving any further commentary, let's just start watching a few of the clips. We're going to begin with Dilwale, and I'm going to, obviously, we're just going to see a few clips here. We're not going to see the whole film. We'll be here until evening if we try to watch the whole film. All right, let's, yeah.
You said Kanyadan, right? The gift of...
Kanyadan.
Yeah.
Kanyadan.
How do you spell that?
Oh, yeah, it's Kanya. That's Kanya. Kanya means young girl, and Dan means gift. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, I don't know what's going on here. This... I don't know why it keeps on freezing. I might have to... Maybe somebody here ought to give a try it while I talk to the class, because we're going to end up wasting our time here if we're not able to get this to it. Yeah, if somebody could try this while I talk to the class, because as I said, we're going to lose time otherwise, right? Just see if you can either unfreeze it or maybe start it again.
Can we start it again?
Yeah, we could start it again as well if okay. All right, let me just say a few more things about both of these films. So on the assumption that not all of you have seen the films in their entirety, right? So let's begin with Dilwale, which of course, as you've seen, the setting is in London, and Pradesh is in the United States. I don't think that, by the way, makes any great difference with respect to the arguments that one wants to make here, because both of these places are seen as being, Pradesh. Pradesh is, as I said, a foreign land, right? A foreign country. Now, the notion of one's own country is a bit more complicated here. All right, so we're back to this now.
How far you want to go, sorry?
So actually, if you could see if we can go up to about 21 minutes first. Yeah, this is fine. Let's just, because otherwise we might end up losing it again. Anybody recognize, for those of you who know Indian music at all, they change the music, right? Because obviously they're not interested in the voice you're hearing. The new record they put on is K.L. Saigal, who was one of these playback singers, but from an earlier generation, and was considered to have obviously this really stupendous voice. And these songs go back to, we're talking about the 40s, 30s, 40s period of that kind. So obviously, one of the things that's being suggested in this little scene here is that Well, there are a number of things that are being suggested here. One is that he obviously exercises immense patriarchal authority. The women in the family, the daughters, the wife, they rule, they live under his thumb, as it were. He's got a certain conception of Indian culture because he's obviously thinking of, these songs that he grew up with in India, 3-4 decades ago, right? So there's this idea of this culture being frozen, ossified. Something that I've spoken to you about. And the question is whether that becomes more so the case in the diasporic setting, when you're removed from the country where things are changing on the ground very rapidly. I mean, I've often actually encountered Indians who, had gone back after 2-3 decades, and they were shocked by how, as they put it to me, sometimes progressive, some middle-class Indians were. That they were allowing their children to do things which they wouldn't allow their children in the United States, right? Because they had a certain conception of what it meant to adhere to Indian culture. And this is obviously one of the things that is at stake here. I also found it interesting, the whole dialogue in the store, because he says, well, aren't you ashamed? And it's not an ethical argument as such, that aren't you ashamed of your conduct? The argument is, aren't you ashamed that you're doing this as an Indian? Right? Because you could have put it in a more general ethical framework. Well, you're coming here on the pretext of, buying an aspirin and having a headache, but what you really want to do is you want to abscond with a whole case of beer, when you've been refused that. Right? So there's a general ethical framework in which you could place this whole dialogue. But what's interesting is his insistence that, you should be ashamed of yourself, not simply because you're doing this and it's quite unethical to do it, because you're deceiving me, but because you're doing this as an Indian. You're betraying certain conceptions of what it means to be Indian. And of course, you could say that it's been set up that way because Shah Rukh Khan, the young man here, he himself, Raj, right, he himself has provoked this train of thought, because when he arrives at his store and the man is just shut the store, he says, look, I've got a headache, and he says, well, look, the store is shut. Then he says, I'm speaking to you as one Indian to another. Right? I'm speaking to you as one Indian to another. So this obviously then provokes that train of thought which leads him to make these comments when he says that you should be ashamed that you're doing this. What happened to the culture that you grew up with, right? Weren't you brought up adequately in an Indian household, even living in London? This is the implication over here. In this 1 month, I would have lived my entire life. Right? It's quite extraordinary, right? Because she's saying to him that, look, I mean, I'll do whatever you want me to do. You're my father. This is my culture. You represent the patriarchal authority that I must follow. And yet she's telling him very gently, I mean, there's no rebuke in her voice, no anger. She's actually telling him that, look, I mean, if you let me go for a month, then that 1 month I would have lived my life. It really doesn't matter what happens after that, even if you're condemning me. Right? Because in effect, she's transmitting that in the gentlest terms. That what you're really doing is you're condemning me to a life that, frankly, I don't really have much invested anything in it. But I mean, I'm going to do it because that's what I'm expected to do. Right? And he doesn't seem to really, I think, catch the significance of that remark. I want to see one more sequence from this film, if I can get this to move. Notice how he addresses his father and how she addresses. She addresses her father in the most reverential terms, and he says, Pops, come on, Pops, So, exaggeration on the other side, exaggeration on both sides. She's completely reverential, will use the most worshipful language, most respectful language. For him, he and his relationship with his father, they're two friends. And there's a scene earlier on in the film, where, I don't know if for those of you who've seen the film, you would recognize that scene where, he's just found out that he's the only person who's failed during the graduation ceremony, right? So he comes back and tells his dad, and then they celebrate because he says, well, that's what my lineage represents. We have all of us failed in college, but nonetheless, look where I am in life. A little bit like George Bush, right? Gives a commencement address at Yale College saying, well, I got a C. I passed out with a C, and I'm still president of the United States. There's hope for everyone in this world. So, he's on very different terms, Raj, with his father, and the contrast is being set up now not just between, that's the point. It's not being just set up between families here and families back there in India. The contrast is in the diaspora itself. And this is what distinguishes this film from Pardes, in part. That the oppositions are not only, India and the West. That within the West itself, there may be actually different diasporic selves, so to speak. Right? Because both of them have always lived over here. It's very clear. And he's on very different terms with, his father. She's on very different terms. And you could say that the differences in part have to do with the fact that men have more liberty than women, perhaps. But that raises an interesting question. What is a space for freedom for women? Because, of course, one of the arguments that's very often given in literature, and when I say literature, I mean two kinds of literature, both sociological literature and fiction. If you look at writers who have become widely known especially among young Indian women, I would say, in the diaspora. I mean, the best example, we're not reading her, Chitra Deva Kurni. A very, very popular writer. And many of her stories and novels have to do precisely with this question of what is a space of freedom for women, Indian women, South Asian women in the diaspora, the suggestion being that there's greater space for freedom. Now, is that really the case, with Simran in this particular film? So I'm saying to you that the contrast is not only between India and the US, it's also that in India itself, there is a West within India, and in the West, there are different diasporic selves that are really coming into conflict here. Just go to the other film, but I want to mention one thing. Now, this film is made in 1995. Okay. Interestingly, so the second half of the film is all set in India, and it's set in the Punjab. And the Punjab had just gone through nearly 2 decades of extreme violence. Not a hint of that in this film. Not a hint of it. Right? And why had it gone through it? You're going to hear more about it when we come to a later segment of this class, when we're going to look at Sikhs in the United States and this particular case. When we look at the issue of rights and privileges and entitlements. Something that I've hinted at before, that there have been cases involving Sikh children who wanted to go to school carrying this little kirpan with them. Right. So that's a case we're going to look at. Now, what is the bearing of all of this on the film? What we're trying to understand is this film is is made in 1995. It's depicting those times, and the overwhelming feature of those times, apart from this neoliberalization, apart from the emergence of a diasporic presence, is the fact that the Punjab went through the most brutal period of violence because there was a secessionist movement. Right? Sikh secessionists who wanted to carve out a separate state called Khalistan. And most of these secessionists, when they're going to be hounded by the state, because no state is going to let secessionists make a demand of that kind, obviously. Right? So there's going to be open violence. And it is true that the most significant episode of that violence took place in 1984 when some of the Sikh extremists had holed up inside the Golden Temple, which is the most venerable of all the Sikh shrines. Right? And then there was a gun battle literally between these extremists and the Indian state, and these terrorists as they're described by the Indian state. I'm using the word secessionists, right? That they're going to be eliminated. But this problem will continue. It will simmer for at least a decade or two. so when this film is being made, and it's set really in the 80s, 90s, this is a critical problem. But the film does not even remotely hint at it. It's almost like an idyllic Punjab that is being shown here. And of course, one of the reasons why the filmmaker is doing it is precisely because the filmmaker is trying to establish the fact that Baldev Singh, when he returns, Simran's father, when he returns to India, he has this idea of Punjab as this idyllic land of, let's not call it, milk and honey, it's milk and mustard seeds, Right? That's how he imagines it. And of course it's going to play into it, and for those of you who know something about India, you know that this idea of the ethereal presence, the touch of the earth, the feel of the soil, the smells, this is intrinsically a part of Punjabi self-representation, and this is what the film builds on over here. So, the minute it moves into the Punjab, the first thing you see is like a bhangra, right? Which, as you know, is very popular in the United States, in the Indian diasporic population. So these are some of the things, again, that you want to keep in mind. But we're going to have to move on to some clips from the other film very quickly, so that we can get some sense of how. Okay, so YouTube, oops. Okay. $189. All right. This is the full film. So this is they're related to the to Suraj family, and distant relations. They have a separate home. You can see, by the way, from his dress. And again, this is the element of exaggeration. The Hindi film makes sure that you don't lose the point. The point here is that he's highly westernized. He's wearing a bow tie, in some farmhouse in the Punjab, right? Okay, and his son is, doing the weights, pumping iron, trying to build up his muscles, being rocky, right? Wears sunglasses. You see, the contrast is done with this kind of exaggeration, with deliberation, and he's hopeful, this man, that his son will be married to her, okay, to the young woman. And in fact, there's been talk of this marriage, but nothing has been promised. So this is the scene that's set up here. We're going to watch this for a couple of minutes because you're going to hear something about the NRI, and then I'll explain. So the Indian who's come, so she says, well, so what if they've come from Sri Lanka? An Indian who comes from Sri Lanka is also an NRI. So let me just spend half a minute talking about that and I'll let you go. NRI is non-resident Indian. Right? So all of us who are South Asians here, we are all, if you're from India, you're a non-resident Indian. Right? Now, this might seem like a simply innocuous description. It's not. And the reason it isn't is because the generic sense of it would include Indians living everywhere, whether it's the United States or Trinidad or Dubai or anywhere else. But it was always understood that the acronym had been invented for the Indian who came from the industrialized countries of the North, particularly the United States. Right? So this is the significance of that dialogue, because these people are NRIs too, and if you're an NRI, your market value immediately goes up in India. Immediately goes up, right? Unless you're obviously working in some obscure job that you don't want anybody to know about back home in India. Right? But otherwise, your market value and your marriageable value goes up. When they put out advertisements for wedding, for marriages, for prospective brides and bridegrooms. So there's a separate category in Indian newspapers, and it's called green card holder. So green card is people who are permanent residents of the United States. All right, and then U.S. citizens, and it'll say NRI, Non-resident Indian, because it immediately means that your market value or your marriageable value goes up a little bit. Right? So here the suggestion is that, well, they're NRIs, but they're not the real NRIs. They're the pseudo NRIs. Why? Because they come from Sri Lanka. I mean, who really wants to come from Sri Lanka? Your value doesn't go up simply because you've come from Sri Lanka. Right? That's the significance of that little dialogue that you have over there. And it's very important because it'll help us understand later on, particularly when we come to week 10, what is the politics of the whole business of being an NRI. So we stop here, and we will see some more clips from this film on